Jake Morrison stood on the metal deck of his ship and looked at the big screen in front of him. The screen showed a planet that was dying. Fire covered most of its surface and dark smoke filled its sky. This was not just any planet. This was the home of the beings who had saved humanity 300 years ago. The beings were called the Etherians. They looked like tall figures made of pure light. They could fly through space without ships and talk to each other using their minds. When Earth's sun started to die too early, the Etherians came to help. They moved 2 billion humans to a new world called New Terra. They asked for nothing except one promise. When they needed help, humans would come. Now that time had arrived. Jake walked to his command chair and sat down. Around him, other humans worked at their stations. The ship was called the UES Defiance. It was one of 57 ships that humans had sent to help the Etherians. Jake knew it was not enough. The enemy they faced was too strong. The enemy was called the Void Seekers. They were not like normal creatures. They looked like giant shadows that moved through space. When they touched something, it would disappear forever. Not just destroyed, but gone as if it never existed. They had already made many alien races disappear completely. Lisa Parker sat at her station near Jake. She was a scientist who studied alien life. She had read all the reports about the Void Seekers. Each report made her more worried. The shadow creatures did not just kill people, they erased them from reality itself. Worlds that once had billions of people were now empty. Even the records of those people were gone. Frank Davis was the leader of all human ships. He was an old man with gray hair and tired eyes. He had fought in many wars, but never against an enemy like this. 3 days ago, he got a message from the Etherian leader. The message was short and simple. It said that the Etherians were losing their war. They needed help from their human friends. The Human Colonial Senate met to decide what to do. The meeting happened on New Terra in a big building made of white stone. Senators from all human colonies came to vote. They knew the facts. Humans were weak compared to other aliens. Their ships were slow. Their weapons were simple. Many aliens saw humans as children who had just learned to walk among the stars. But humans remembered their debt. Kate Williams was a senator from the outer colonies. She stood up to speak. Her voice was clear and strong. She said that humans might be young and weak, but they were not without honor. She reminded everyone that the Etherians had saved them when no one else would help. Now it was time to return that favor. The vote was unanimous. Every senator voted to send help to the Etherians. Ryan Brooks was the captain of one of the human ships. His ship was called the UES Determination. He was a young man with brown hair and quick hands. He had never seen real war before. As his ship moved through hyperspace toward the Etherian homeworld, he got reports from other parts of the galaxy. The reports were bad. The Harmony were a race of aliens that lived as pure music. They had existed for millions of years. Now they were silent forever. The Depth Dwellers lived in the deep oceans of water worlds. The Void Seekers had drained their oceans dry. Even the Nexus, which was a giant computer that spanned many star systems, had been reduced to broken metal floating in space. Every advanced race in the galaxy was either dead or running away. Only the Etherians still fought, and they were losing. Amy Rodriguez worked in the engine room of the UES Defiance. She was trying to make human weapons better. Human ships used simple projectile weapons that fired metal bullets. They also had nuclear bombs. Compared to the energy weapons that other aliens used, human weapons seemed like toys from the past. But Amy had an idea. Maybe simple was better. Maybe the Void Seekers were used to fighting advanced weapons. Maybe they had never faced something as basic as a metal bullet fired from a magnetic railgun. Carl Peterson was the smartest human in the fleet. He studied all the data about the Void Seekers. He found something strange. The shadow creatures seemed to get stronger when they fought. More advanced enemies. The more complex a civilization was, the faster it fell to the Void Seekers. This gave Carl a dangerous idea. What if the Void Seekers fed on advancement? What if they grew stronger when they absorbed high technology? If this was true, then humans might have an advantage. Humans were the least advanced race in the galaxy. They still used crude weapons and simple tactics. On the Etherean homeworld of Lumina Prime, High Counselor Ethel watched the protective shields around his planet grow weak. The shields had protected his people for 1,000 years. Now they flickered like dying candles. The Void Seekers pressed closer every day. Their dark tentacles had already consumed the outer moons. When Ethel heard that humans were coming to help, he felt both grateful and sad. He was grateful because humans remembered their debt. He was sad because he knew humans could not win. How could such a young race succeed where the galaxy's greatest powers had failed? But the Etherians had no choice. They would welcome any help, even from their young human friends. The human fleet moved through hyperspace like a school of small fish, swimming toward a giant whale. Jake Morrison knew his people were outmatched. He knew they would probably die. But he also knew something else. Humans did not give up easily. They had survived ice ages, plagues, wars, and the death of their own son. They would face this enemy, too. As the fleet got closer to Lumina Prime, Jake thought about the promise his people had made 300 years ago. The Etherians had asked for nothing but friendship. They had given humans a new home and a chance to grow among the stars. Now it was time to pay that debt, no matter the cost. The ship's computer announced that they would reach Lumina Prime in 6 hours. Jake stood up and walked to the big screen again. Soon he would see if human courage could stand against an enemy that had conquered the galaxy. Soon he would learn if sometimes being young and stubborn was enough to change the fate of all living things. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Lumina system. Jake Morrison looked at his screens and felt his heart sink. The space around the Etherian homeworld was filled with the wreckage of destroyed ships. Pieces of metal and crystal floated in the darkness like the bones of dead giants. The Etherian ships that were still fighting looked beautiful and terrible at the same time. They glowed with bright energy and moved like dancers through space. But there were so few of them left. Jake could see the enemy too. The Void Seekers looked like giant shadows with long tentacles. They moved slowly, but nothing could stop them. Ryan Brooks watched from the bridge of his ship as an Etherian cruiser simply vanished. One moment it was there, firing beams of pure light at a Void Seeker. The next moment, it was gone. Not destroyed or broken, just gone as if it had never existed. The crew, the ship, even the records of its existence had been erased. Linda Hayes commanded another human ship called the UES Determination. She was a tough woman with short black hair and steady hands. She had been in the human navy for 20 years. She had seen many battles, but nothing like this. The Void Seekers did not fight like normal enemies. They did not try to destroy things. They simply made things stop existing. Steve Coleman was the captain of a science ship called the UES Discovery. His job was to study the battle and learn how the Void Seekers worked. What he saw made no sense. The shadow creatures seemed to exist in many dimensions at once. They could reach through space and time to touch things that should have been safe. As the human ships moved closer to join the battle, they received a message from the Etherian Command Center. The message came from General Veltar, a being made of pure energy who had fought the Void Seekers for hundreds of years. The general's words were filled with despair. The general explained that the Etherians had tried everything. They had used their most powerful weapons. They had called on ancient technologies that could reshape reality itself. Nothing worked. The Void Seekers seemed to grow stronger with each attack. It was as if the shadow creatures fed on the very advancement that made civilizations great. Amy Rodriguez worked frantically in her engineering bay. She was trying to modify human weapons to be more effective against the Void Seekers. But every simulation showed the same result. Human projectile weapons and nuclear bombs seemed to have no effect on the shadow creatures. The metal bullets passed right through them. The nuclear explosions did not even slow them down. Carl Peterson sat in his small office, surrounded by data screens and old books. He was reading every report about the Void Seekers that he could find. The pattern was always the same. The most advanced civilizations fell first. The Nexus had been a computer intelligence that spanned entire solar systems. It fell in less than a day. The harmony had been beings of pure thought and music. They were silenced in hours, but there was something else in the data, something that gave Carl hope. A few primitive species had survived longer than expected. Not because they were strong, but because they were simple. The Void Seekers seemed to have trouble with creatures that had not advanced very far. Elena Foster commanded a small frigate called the UES Resilience. She was watching the battle through her ship's sensors when she noticed something odd. When human ships were hit by Void Seeker attacks, they did not vanish like alien ships did. They were damaged or destroyed, but the wreckage remained. The human crews who died left bodies behind. They were not erased from existence. This was important. It meant that humans were somehow resistant to the Void Seeker's power. Not immune, but resistant. It was like the difference between being killed by a sword and being erased by magic. Humans could be killed, but they could not be made to have never existed. Troy Anderson was a young lieutenant who worked on Jake Morrison's ship. He was studying the sensor readings from the battle when he made a discovery. The Void Seekers were not just shadows. They were creatures that existed between dimensions. They used their multidimensional nature to reach into normal space and erase things. But when they tried to erase humans, something went wrong. Humans were too tied to the physical universe. They were too real, too solid, too stubbornly present. The Void Seekers could hurt humans, but they could not make them disappear completely. General Veltar contacted the human fleet directly. The Etherian general was desperate. His people were losing the war. Their homeworld was under direct attack. The protective shields that had guarded Lumina Prime for 1,000 years were failing. Soon the Void Seekers would reach the planet's surface. The general asked the humans to retreat. He said it was hopeless. The shadow creatures were too powerful. Even the combined might of a dozen advanced civilizations had not been enough to stop them. What could 57 human ships do? But Frank Davis, the human admiral, refused to retreat. He told the general that humans had made a promise. They had come to honor their debt, not to run away at the first sign of danger. The human fleet would fight alongside the Etherians until the end. Nancy Phillips was an expert in old military tactics. She had studied the wars that humans fought before they reached the stars. She knew about strategies that had been forgotten by most advanced civilizations. Things like flanking maneuvers, concentrated fire, and hit-and-run attacks. These were tactics that worked when you were weaker than your enemy. Nancy began to develop a battle plan. It was based on ancient human warfare, not on the energy-based combat that most aliens used. Her plan was simple and brutal. The human ships would work together like a pack of wolves, hunting a much larger prey. As the human fleet took its position, in the battle line, Jake Morrison spoke to all the ship captains. He reminded them that they were fighting for more than just the Etherians. They were fighting for the memory of everyone who had been erased by the Void Seekers. They were fighting to prove that some things could not be destroyed, no matter how powerful the enemy. The first human attack began at dawn, Lumina Prime time. 57 ships fired their primitive weapons at the nearest Void Seeker. Magnetic railguns launched metal projectiles at incredible speeds. Missile launchers fired nuclear warheads. Chemical rockets carried explosive charges toward the shadow creature. Most of the weapons passed harmlessly through the Void Seeker's dimensional form, but something strange happened. The creature seemed to notice the humans for the first time. It turned its attention away from an Etherian battleship and focused on the small human fleet. This was exactly what Nancy Phillips had hoped for. While the Void Seeker was distracted by the humans, the Etherian ships could regroup and attack from a different angle. It was not much, but it was the first tactical success anyone had achieved against the shadow creatures in 1,000 years. Carl Peterson watched the battle data with growing excitement. His theory was proving correct. The Void Seekers were having trouble with human weapons not because the weapons were powerful, but because they were primitive. The shadow creatures had evolved to fight advanced civilizations. They did not know how to handle simple metal bullets and chemical explosives. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a very long time, the galaxy's defenders had hope. Humanity had found a way to make the Void Seekers pay attention. Now they had to find a way to make them pay in blood. The battle around Lumina Prime had been raging for 6 hours when Jake Morrison realized they were losing badly. 3 human ships had already been destroyed, and the Void Seekers seemed endless. For every shadow creature that the combined human and Etherian forces managed to drive away, 2 more appeared from the dark spaces between dimensions. Elena Foster gripped her command chair as her frigate shook under another attack. The UES Resilience had taken heavy damage, but it was still fighting. Through her view screen, she watched an Etherian dreadnought the size of a small moon simply cease to exist when a Void Seeker wrapped its tentacles around it. The massive ship, along with its crew of 10,000 energy beings, was gone in an instant. What made it worse was the silence. When normal ships exploded, there was debris and radiation. When the Void Seekers erased something, there was nothing. No wreckage to mark where brave soldiers had made their last stand. No memorial for the fallen. Just empty space where something had once been. Frank Davis studied the tactical display in his command center and felt the weight of impossible decisions. Every minute he was losing ships and crews. The Etherian forces were down to less than half their original strength. The protective barriers around Lumina Prime were failing section by section. Soon the shadow creatures would reach the planet's surface, where billions of Etherian civilians waited in underground shelters. On the planet, below, Jake Morrison led a small team of humans to meet with the Etherian military command. The capital city of Lumina Prime was a marvel of crystal and light that stretched up into the clouds. But now the beautiful towers were dark and empty. Most of the population had fled to deep bunkers carved into the planet's core. The command center was buried a mile underground. Jake walked through corridors filled with Etherian soldiers who glowed with dim, tired light. These beings had been fighting for 1,000 years. They were exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. They were losing hope. General Veltar met Jake in a chamber lined with screens showing the battle above. The Etherian general looked like a tall figure made of blue fire, but his flames were weak and flickering. He had been alive for 2,000 years and had never seen his people face total defeat before. The general showed Jake the true scope of the war. The battle around Lumina Prime was just one small part of a much larger conflict. Across the galaxy, the Void Seekers were advancing on all fronts. Entire sectors that had once held hundreds of inhabited worlds were now empty space. The shadow creatures were not just winning the war. They were erasing the very existence of galactic civilization. Carl Peterson stood beside Jake, taking notes on a simple paper notebook. He had brought the notebook because electronic devices sometimes malfunctioned around the Void Seekers. As the general spoke, Carl's theory about the shadow creatures began to take clearer shape in his mind. The Void Seekers fed on advancement. They drew power from complex technology, sophisticated tactics, and evolved consciousness. The more advanced a civilization was, the more energy the shadow creatures could drain from it. This was why the greatest powers of the galaxy had fallen so quickly. But humans were different. They were newcomers to galactic civilization. They still used primitive weapons and simple strategies. More importantly, they had never fully abandoned their biological origins. While other races had evolved beyond physical form or merged with advanced technology, humans remained stubbornly organic. Lisa Parker was studying the Void Seekers through her scientific instruments when she made a startling discovery. The shadow creatures existed in multiple dimensions at once, but they were not equally strong in all of them. In the higher dimensions where energy and thought existed, they were almost godlike. But in the basic physical dimension where matter and simple force ruled, they were much weaker. This meant that primitive attacks might actually hurt them. Not because crude weapons were powerful, but because they operated in the one dimension where the Void Seekers were vulnerable. A metal bullet fired by magnetic force was completely physical. It had no complex energy patterns for the shadow creatures. To feed on Troy Anderson was monitoring communications when he intercepted a desperate message from a group of survivors in the Outer Rim. They were refugees from dozens of extinct civilizations who had banded together on a forgotten mining station. The message described how they had managed to hide from the Void Seekers by abandoning all advanced technology and living like primitives. The refugees had discovered that the shadow creatures could not sense them if they avoided using complex machines or energy weapons. They survived by using fire, simple tools, and basic chemistry. It was not much of a life, but it was life nonetheless. Jake Morrison gathered all this information and formed a desperate plan. If the Void Seekers were weak against primitive attacks, then humanity would give them the most primitive warfare possible. The human fleet would strip away all their advanced systems and fight using only basic weapons and ancient tactics. Amy Rodriguez thought Jake had lost his mind when he explained the plan. He wanted her to remove the energy shields, quantum computers, and dimensional drives from every human ship. They would fight using only chemical rockets, magnetic launchers, and nuclear fission bombs. It was like asking knights in armor to fight with wooden clubs. But as Amy thought about it, she began to see the logic. The Void Seekers had evolved to fight energy weapons and dimensional manipulators. They had probably never encountered chemical, explosives, and kinetic projectiles. The shadow creatures might be confused by attacks that were too simple for them to understand. Nancy Phillips began working on battle tactics based on wars from Earth's ancient past. She studied naval battles from the age of sailing ships and aerial combat from the early days of flight. These were strategies that no galactic civilization had used for millions of years. They were so old that they might seem completely new to the Void Seekers. Ryan Brooks was the first captain to volunteer for the mission. He ordered his crew to strip the UES determination of all its advanced systems. Within hours, his ship went from being a modern cruiser to something that looked like it belonged in a museum. But Brooks felt strangely confident. Sometimes the old ways were the best ways. Steve Coleman used his science ship to test the theory. He launched a probe armed with nothing but a chemical explosive and a simple timer. The probe flew straight at a small Void Seeker that was feeding on the wreckage of an Etherian frigate. When the chemical bomb exploded, something amazing happened. The Void Seeker recoiled as if it had been struck by lightning. Its dimensional form flickered and became solid for a few seconds. During those seconds, it looked like a creature made of living shadow with dozens of writhing tentacles. More importantly, it looked vulnerable. The news spread through the human fleet like wildfire. For the first time since the war began, someone had found a way to hurt the Void Seekers. It was not much, but it was a beginning. Jake Morrison gave the order for all human ships to begin the conversion to primitive weapons. As the human crews worked frantically to strip their ships, the battle around Lumina Prime continued to go badly. 2 more Etherian battleships were erased from existence. The planetary shields failed completely on the night side of the planet. The Void Seekers began descending toward the surface like a plague of living darkness. But in the depths of space, 54 human ships were preparing to fight a war unlike any that had been fought in a million years. They were going backwards, in time, abandoning the advanced weapons of the space age to fight with tools their ancestors would recognize. It was a gamble that could save the galaxy or doom them all. Jake Collins was the first human pilot to test the new primitive weapons against a Void Seeker in real combat. He flew a small fighter that had been stripped of everything except a chemical rocket engine and 2 magnetic railguns loaded with solid metal slugs. As he approached the shadow creature, his hands were shaking on the controls. The Void Seeker was feeding on the remains of an Etherian transport ship. It looked like a massive jellyfish made of living darkness, with tentacles that reached through multiple dimensions at once. Jake had seen these creatures erase entire battleships with a single touch. Now he was flying directly toward one in a ship that was barely more advanced than the first rockets humans had built on Earth. Jake squeezed the trigger and fired both railguns at once. 2 chunks of dense metal shot out at incredible speed, powered by nothing more than magnetic force and Newton's laws of motion. The projectiles struck the Void Seeker's main body, and something extraordinary happened. The shadow creature convulsed like it had been electrocuted. Its tentacles whipped through space as it let out a sound that no human had ever heard before. It was not quite a scream, and not quite the tearing of fabric, but something in between. For the first time in recorded history, a Void Seeker had been hurt by a direct attack. The effect rippled across the entire battlefield. Every sensor in the human fleet registered the event. Every Etherian ship detected the disturbance in the shadow creature's dimensional field. General Veltar sent an urgent message to the human command asking what kind of weapon they had used. Jake Morrison almost laughed when he replied. They had used a chunk of iron fired by magnets. The most primitive projectile weapon imaginable had succeeded where advanced energy beams and dimensional manipulators had failed. The Void Seekers were vulnerable to simple, brutal physical force. Amy Rodriguez felt like she was living in a dream as she watched the sensor readings. The shadow creature that Jake Collins had hit was not just wounded, it was being forced back into normal space-time. Its ability to exist in multiple dimensions was failing. For a few minutes, it became a normal creature that could be seen, tracked, and destroyed by conventional weapons. The Etherian ships immediately took advantage of this opportunity. Energy beams that had passed harmlessly through the Void Seekers' dimensional form now struck its physical body with devastating effect. The shadow creature died in a burst of light that was visible from the planet's surface. Nancy Phillips had been coordinating the human fleet's conversion to primitive weapons. When news of the successful attack reached her, she immediately put her ancient battle plans into action. The human ships formed up in formations that had not been used since the early days of space warfare. They prepared to fight like pirates and raiders from humanity's violent past. Ryan Brooks led the first wave of attack ships toward a group of 3 Void Seekers that were approaching the planet's north pole. His ship, the UES Determination, now looked like a floating arsenal of crude weapons. Chemical rocket launchers covered its hull like the spines of a metal hedgehog. Nuclear warheads hung from external racks like bombs from an ancient warplane. The attack began with a barrage of simple explosives. Hundreds of chemical rockets streaked toward the Void Seekers, leaving trails of fire across the dark sky. Most of the rockets missed their targets, but enough hit to make the shadow creatures writhe in pain and confusion. For creatures that existed across multiple dimensions, the simple concept of chemical combustion was apparently very difficult to understand. Linda Hayes brought her heavy cruiser into close range and fired everything she had. Nuclear warheads exploded in brilliant flashes of light and heat. Magnetic railguns hurled metal projectiles at speeds that would have impressed the ancient gods of war. Chemical explosives detonated in patterns that followed no sophisticated tactical doctrine except the simple rule of concentrating firepower on single targets. The Void Seekers tried to fight back, but their usual tactics were not working. They had evolved to drain energy from advanced weapons and complex technology. When faced with crude explosives and kinetic weapons, they seemed almost helpless. Their dimensional manipulation abilities kept failing as the primitive attacks forced them back into normal space. Elena Foster watched in amazement as her small frigate successfully drove off a Void Seeker that was 10 times larger than her ship. The shadow creature had tried to erase the UES resilience from existence, but the ship's simple construction and basic systems seemed to resist the effect. Instead of vanishing, the frigate just took normal damage that could be repaired. Steve Coleman was documenting everything from his science ship. He recorded how the Void Seekers reacted to different types of primitive weapons. Chemical explosives seemed to confuse them. Kinetic projectiles caused them physical pain. Nuclear weapons forced them back into normal dimensions where they could be destroyed by conventional means. But the most important discovery was that human crews could survive close encounters with the shadow creatures. Other alien species were erased along with their ships when the Void Seekers attacked. Humans died when their ships were destroyed, but they died as individuals, not as erased possibilities. Their sacrifice meant something because they remained, real even in death. Carl Peterson realized that this was the key to understanding human resistance to the Void Seekers. Humans were too primitive to be erased. They existed too firmly in the basic physical dimension. They were real in a way that highly evolved beings were not. This gave them a unique advantage in the war against creatures that fed on advancement and complexity. The tide of battle began to turn as more human ships joined the attack. The Etherian forces, inspired by humanity's success, started adopting primitive tactics alongside their energy weapons. General Veltar ordered his ships to ram the Void Seekers when possible, using simple kinetic force instead of sophisticated energy attacks. Troy Anderson coordinated communications between the human and Etherian fleets. He watched as the two different approaches to warfare began to complement each other. Human primitive attacks would force the Void Seekers into normal space, and then Etherian energy weapons would finish them off. It was crude but effective. The Void Seekers had never faced an enemy that deliberately made itself less advanced in order to be more effective. They had conquered the galaxy by turning civilization's own progress against them. But humans were willing to abandon progress when it served their purpose. They would fight with rocks and sticks if that was what it took to win. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance and watched his people prove that sometimes going backward was the best way to move forward. The human fleet had lost 12 ships in the battle, but they had destroyed more than 30 Void Seekers. For the first time in 1,000 years, the shadow creatures were retreating from a major engagement. But the war was far from over. Reports were coming in from across the galaxy of Void Seeker activities in hundreds of other star systems. Entire sectors were still under attack. The victory at Lumina Prime was just the beginning of what would need to be a galaxy-wide campaign to drive back the shadow creatures. Patricia Bell was already planning the next phase of operations. She was a strategic coordinator who specialized in large-scale military campaigns. Her job was to figure out how to take the lessons learned at Lumina Prime and apply them across thousands of light-years of space. The answer was both simple and terrifying. Humanity would need to abandon most of their technological advancement and revert to primitive warfare, on a scale never before seen in galactic history. They would become the barbarians of space, fighting with crude weapons and ancient tactics, against an enemy that represented the ultimate expression of advancement. It was a role that no other species could fill. Only humans were primitive enough and stubborn enough to make it work. They would save the galaxy by dragging it kicking and screaming back into the dark ages of warfare. And somehow that felt exactly right. News of humanity's victory at Lumina Prime spread across the galaxy faster than the speed of light itself. Quantum communication networks carried the impossible message to every corner of civilized space. The Void Seekers could be hurt. The shadow creatures that had seemed unstoppable for 1,000 years had finally met their match in the crude weapons and primitive tactics of the galaxy's youngest civilization. Frank Davis found himself in a position he had never expected. Alien species that had barely acknowledged humanity's existence were now begging for help. The survivors of the Crystal Singers sent desperate pleas from their hidden refuges in the asteroid fields. The remnants of the Depth Dwellers transmitted urgent requests from the deepest ocean trenches of distant worlds. Even fragments of the Great Nexus computer network reached out with mathematical equations that translated to a single word: "Please, Jake." Morrison stood in the command center of the human fleet and watched as the list of requests for aid grew longer every hour. Hundreds of worlds were under attack by the Void Seekers. Millions of beings were trapped in their path of destruction. The scope of the crisis was overwhelming, but humanity had proven that the shadow creatures could be defeated. The challenge was scale. Humans had only 54 ships left after the battle at Lumina Prime. The Void Seekers had thousands of attack groups spread across the galaxy. To mount an effective defense, humanity would need help from the very civilizations they were trying to save. This led to the strangest alliance in galactic history. Advanced alien races began stripping the sophisticated technology from their own ships so they could fight alongside humans using primitive weapons. The process was painful for beings who had spent millions of years perfecting their technology, but it was the only way to survive. The survivors of the Harmony, who existed as living mathematical equations, learned to express themselves through simple chemical reactions that could power explosive devices. The Crystal Singers, whose entire culture was based on perfect resonance and frequency control, began manufacturing crude sonic weapons that used nothing more than compressed air and metal tubes. Amy Rodriguez became one of the most important humans in the galaxy as she traveled from world to world, teaching alien engineers how to build primitive weapons. It was bizarre to watch beings whose technology could reshape reality itself, learning to make gunpowder and forge metal bullets. The Etherians were the most enthusiastic students. General Veltar himself requested personal training in what he called barbarian warfare tactics. The proud energy being learned to ram enemy ships with his own vessel, and to coordinate attacks using simple radio communications instead of quantum entanglement. Carl Peterson worked with alien scientists to understand why primitive weapons were effective against the Void Seekers. The answer was both simple and profound. The shadow creatures existed in a state of quantum superposition across multiple dimensions. They fed on the complexity and uncertainty that characterized advanced technology and evolved consciousness. But primitive weapons were too simple for the Void Seekers to absorb. A metal bullet had no quantum states to manipulate. A chemical explosion was just atoms rearranging themselves according to basic laws of chemistry. These attacks existed purely in the fundamental dimension of matter and energy, where the shadow creatures were weakest. Ryan Brooks led the first joint human-alien fleet to liberate the crystalline nebula. The nebula had once been home to billions of crystal singers, but it had been dark and silent for months since the Void Seekers arrived. The rescue fleet consisted of human ships armed with primitive weapons and alien vessels that had been deliberately downgraded to fight at humanity's technological level. The battle in the crystalline nebula was unlike anything in recorded history. Beings of pure energy fought alongside humans using chemical rockets. Computer intelligences coordinated with human tacticians to plan attacks based on strategies from ancient Earth warfare. The sight of advanced aliens charging into battle while screaming primitive war cries would have been comical if the stakes had not been so high. But it worked. The combined fleet drove the Void Seekers out of the nebula and rescued the surviving crystal singers from hidden refuge stations. The victory proved that the tactics developed at Lumina Prime could be applied on a larger scale. Linda Hayes commanded the Liberation Fleet that saved the aquatic worlds of the Depth Dwellers. Her ships used depth charges and torpedo attacks based on ancient submarine warfare. The irony was not lost on her that some of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy were being saved by weapons that human navies had abandoned centuries ago. Steve Coleman led scientific expeditions to study Void Seeker remains. His research revealed that the shadow creatures were not native to this galaxy. They had come from the dark spaces between galaxies, where matter was scarce and energy existed in its most basic forms. In their home environment, they were simple predators. Only when they encountered complex civilizations did they become the unstoppable force that had terrorized the galaxy. The war entered a new phase as human-led fleets began systematic campaigns to clear Void Seekers from infected systems. Patricia Bell coordinated the overall strategy from a mobile command center that moved from battle to battle. Her forces grew larger with each victory as more alien survivors joined the primitive warfare crusade. Elena Foster found herself commanding mixed species, crews on ships that looked like floating museums of ancient warfare. Her current vessel was crewed by humans, energy beings, crystal entities, and mechanical intelligences, all working together to operate weapons that their ancestors would have recognized. The climax of the war came at the Void Seekers' primary staging area in the galactic core. This was where the shadow creatures had been gathering for their final assault on the remaining civilized worlds. The location was a region of space that had been completely emptied of matter, existing as a pocket of pure darkness between the stars. Jake Morrison led the final assault with a fleet of 10,000 ships representing every surviving species in the galaxy. But all the vessels had been converted to primitive warfare standards. They carried chemical explosives, kinetic weapons, and nuclear devices, instead of the energy weapons and dimensional manipulators that had once defined galactic military technology. The battle was a masterpiece of coordinated barbarism. Thousands of ships attacked in waves using tactics that had not been employed for millions of years. They rammed enemy vessels, detonated contact mines, and fired volleys of solid projectiles in patterns that would have made ancient human naval commanders proud. Troy Anderson coordinated communications for the massive fleet using simple radio transmissions instead of quantum channels. The primitive communication method was slow and inefficient, but it could not be intercepted or jammed by the Void Seekers' advanced abilities. The shadow creatures fought desperately, but they were facing an enemy that had deliberately rejected the very advancement that made them strong. For every sophisticated attack the Void Seekers launched, they received crude but effective retaliation. Slowly, systematically, they were driven back toward the edge of the galaxy. Nancy Phillips delivered the final blow when she led a kamikaze attack against the largest Voidseeker concentration. Her ship, loaded with every primitive explosive the Alliance could manufacture, rammed directly into the center of the shadow mass. The resulting explosion was visible from halfway across the galaxy and marked the end of the Voidseeker threat. As the last shadow creatures fled into the dark spaces between galaxies, the Alliance ships began the long journey home. They had won the greatest war in galactic history using the oldest weapons known to intelligent life. The victory belonged to all species, but everyone knew that humans had made it possible. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his battle-scarred ship and looked out at a galaxy that had learned to respect the power of primitive courage. The debt that humanity had come to repay had become a gift that saved countless worlds. The galaxy would never again underestimate a species that was willing to go backward in order to move forward. The Etherians formally declared humanity as the galaxy's protectors. Other civilizations quickly followed, understanding that sometimes the newest voice in the council spoke with the oldest wisdom. Humanity had proven that advancement was not always about becoming more complex. Sometimes it was about remembering the simple truths that made survival possible. Frank Davis received the final reports as the human fleet returned to New Terra. The galaxy was safe, but it was also forever changed. The great civilizations would rebuild, but they would never again rely solely on advancement and complexity for their defense. They had learned the value of keeping some primitive weapons and simple tactics in reserve. The war was over, but the Yayan relationship it had forged would reshape galactic civilization for millions of years to come. In a universe full of evolved beings who had transcended their origins, humanity remained proudly and dangerously primitive, and the galaxy was grateful for that difference.